Good morning to those of you in the United States. Good afternoon to those of you here in the United Kingdom and across Europe. And good evening to those of you far beyond. I'm Leslie. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House, and I'm Dean of our Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership, which I think is an appropriate title to remind ourselves of today because we take leadership very, very seriously. And it's very hard to imagine a more important and influential and dynamic and exciting leader than you, Indra Nooyi. We are delighted to have you here at Chatham House for this conversation, which will be on the record. It will be recorded. Indra Nooyi has recently shared with her the story of really her career, her life as a mother, as a leader, as a family member, in her new book, My Life in Full: Work, Family, and Our Future. And I have to say, Indra, I read it over the weekend and I am thrilled and inspired and honored to welcome you here to Chatham House. Indra will be in conversation with Fred Hochberg. Fred is by now, I hope, very well known to many of you at Chatham House. He has engaged with us on his own work on trade, on his recent book in our Global Trade Policy Forum, and has begun to bring some of the most important leaders alongside of himself to Chatham House for these kinds of very special conversations. Fred was chairman of the Export-Import Bank from 2009 to 2017, chairman and CEO, the longest standing chairman of the Export-Import Bank. He's also had leadership positions across many sectors, including one that's near and dear to my heart, the New School in New York City. Indra Nooyi needs no introduction. She was CEO and chair of PepsiCo from 2006 to 2019. In 2015, Fortune magazine named you, Indra, the second most powerful woman in international business. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for talking to us about leadership. And thank you so much for your book, which I have to say, the lessons for women, for immigrants, for young people who are ambitious and driven, seeking to balance family and life and to really have an impact are big and they're profound, but they're also very granular and very, very special. So I will turn it over to you, Fred, and with my very great thanks on behalf of all of my colleagues at Chatham House for bringing Indra to us, for taking your time, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Indra. And just to re-emphasize the book, this is a terrific book. This is a terrific book. I am biased. I'm a good friend of Indra's, so I was anxious to read it. And my mother, Lillian Vernon, was also an immigrant, also wrote a book. So there's a lot I related to, but I will say, Indra, if I can be perfectly candid, your book is far better and more candid, more forthright. And, you know, the challenge, frankly, with autobiographies, I tend to prefer a biography because there's a little more critical distance. But what this book, and I hope this conversation encourages you if you haven't read it, is this is one of the most candid, forthright book that someone has written about themselves. And to do that, you really have to dig deep and you really have to be very, and really get to your authentic self. And that comes through very clearly throughout this book in page after page. One of the things that early in the book, and it reminded me when Indra and I met in 2009, is when Prime Minister Singh came to Washington for, I think it was the first state dinner of the new administration. And Indra refers to that in the book where at some level, both the Prime Minister and President Obama claim Indra as their own. They're fighting over her. And I remember that dinner, Indra, because we at the Export-Import Bank, we had a large commitment to Air India, and they were having a lot of challenges. And so I had one objective at that meeting at that dinner was to speak to the Prime Minister, underscore our commitment, and make sure we were going to get paid. And I remember I said to him, I told him all this, and I said, you know, we're a large creditor to Air India. We're very happy to. And he looked at me and he says, well, I hope they pay you. which was not the response I was hoping for at that time.
At least he was honest.
He was very honest. So this book is very personal. It also is a call to action. So I thought I would break our conversation into sort of three areas. Talk a little bit about the book and your experiences, talk about your thoughts about the economy and capitalism, and what changes you think are needed in the workplace going forward. So I'm very happy you shared this, your story with us, and frankly, chose to emigrate to America. And there's also a piece in here, and it's the only quote I'm going to read in the book. And because I think it relates to this conversation, you say, I believe in the American story because this is my story. As a CEO, I once sat in the 18th century wood panel dining room at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country manor. I was asked why I immigrated 30 years earlier to the US and not the UK. And you responded, because, Mr. Prime Minister, I wouldn't be sitting here lunching with you if I'd come to the UK. And so this book is very much about, and I thought about a movie with Julie Andrews, Indra, called The Americanization of Emily that came out in 1962. Oh. And in some way, this book is the Americanization in part of Indra Nooyi and how you became a icon, a CEO of a Fortune probably 50 company, and certainly not 500. So tell us about coming to America, studying at Yale, and how what influenced that trajectory for you?
Fred, thank you. First of all, thanks to Chatham House for inviting me to this session. We have to rewrite what Chatham House is because typically we've said Chatham House is off the record, but this is on the record, but that's fine. It's a privilege to be in conversation with you. I honestly believe and truly believe that my story is the American dream because I came here as a young student, almost penniless. I could only take out $500 from India. But I didn't come as a refugee. I didn't come because I was fleeing persecution. I came through the front door with a valid visa to go to school. I went to school and then fell in love with the United States, incredibly in love with the United States. And I chose to make a career here. And along the way, I was helped along by so many mentors who basically pushed me from job to job and pulled me up when I struggled or gave me a slap when I didn't do as well as I could have. And so I owe my success to a lot of those mentors, all white males, I may add. So I am a product of my parents, my upbringing, the fact that they gave me permission to cross the oceans and come to the United States, Yale, which gave me a great education, and also gave me the pedigree because I could tell people I went to the Yale School of Business and people assumed you were smart as a consequence. And then all the mentors and the experiences I had along the way. And I moved from being somebody incredibly naive and, smart, but really not well put together, let me put it that way. And over time, I evolved and got much more with it. So as I look at the photographs of myself in my early days, I cringe because, I didn't know how to dress. I didn't have the basic finesse of being a senior executive. But over time, I learned it all. So I am a story of the great American dream, which is if you work hard, if you believe in the country, if you believe in democracy, if you believe in free markets, the opportunities are endless. And people do really step up and push you along and pull you along.
Can you tell us a little bit, because you go into in depth in the book about mentors, and you also teach leadership at West Point. One, what can you be a little specific? What one or two mentors really brought something out in you or helped shape you? And then also, you have spawned many CEOs who worked for you at Pepsi and went on to become CEOs elsewhere. So what's in the secret sauce there?
I think mentorship is a very unselfish assignment for anybody. And I'm talking about mentorship with a capital M, not just giving advice, but promoting, supporting, advising, pulling them along. That's real mentorship. And it takes time. And you have to be willing to mentor somebody who could even take your job. So you have to do it unselfishly and with no insecurities, because the whole idea is you create the great leaders of tomorrow for your company, and the company is going to be successful. Don't worry about yourself. And so everybody I worked with who were mentors of mine were my bosses. And they did it unselfishly and they had no insecurity. And, over time, they'd give me very tough feedback, Fred, really tough feedback, but I didn't get upset. I always took that feedback and made changes. And if I didn't
give an example of that tough feedback?
Oh, sure. I remember when I was in Motorola, I had this very blunt way of giving feedback when we were in strategy sessions. I was head of corporate strategy. We went to a division, and when they finished the presentation and it came my turn to make a comment, I just looked at the leaders and said, that was a terrible presentation. Your strategy and your financials had nothing to do with each other. And if you execute the strategy, you can't deliver those financials. But if you're going to deliver those financials, the strategy has to be thrown out of the window. There was this hush when I said this, and I was very proud that I created that impact in the meeting. On the way back, the CEO sat me down on the plane and said, you and I need to talk. There was nothing wrong with what you said, but you could have said it differently to really, hit the mark differently and to actually make people feel good in the process. Instead, what you did was almost throw hand grenades in the whole room by making those leaders feel very bad in front of me, the CEO. I looked at him and I said, how could I have said this? Because I had no clue. I thought this was the right way to say it. He said, well, what I would have done if I were you is to say, look, I thought your strategy was very, very good. It was well thought through. It really positions this business for long-term success. And so my compliments. But are you sure you have enough investments in your financials to support your strategy? What do we need to do to help you get to the right investments? So if you look at his line of comments, it would have gotten to the same place that I got to, but in a much nicer way. Now, when he gave me that feedback, Fred, I cringed that I was so blunt and I was so proud of being so blunt. And over time, I've learned to give feedback with a lot more words than what I was used to. I struggled. I was flustered because I had to use so many words and soften everything. But over time, I realized it was much more effective. Fast forward. When I started as CEO of PepsiCo, the first thing I started was developing a successor for myself. I did it when I was president and CFO. I did it when I was CEO. And my point was, it doesn't matter if in 2 years I'm without a job, but the company should always have CEO succession candidates ready to take my job if I got hit by a bus. And my board insisted on that. So over time, I'd spend hours coaching, mentoring, pushing, pulling my people. I'd go out, recruit the best and the brightest, give them pretty tough feedback, not the way I used to give in Motorola, but when they turned in a piece of work to me, I write a note on that saying, it's 60% of the way there. They take it back, work on it, come back. Then I'd say, 60 to 65. I'm sure you can do better. But then if I found that they got stuck, I would spend my time telling them how to cross hurdles. And so I spent a lot of time coaching, developing, mentoring. And the good news is between 2016 and 2006 and the time I left, there were 9 people from PepsiCo who went on to be CEOs of US industry. 9 people I'd hired and developed.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and so I feel good about that whole process, but it requires commitment of time, your energy, and honesty. And the fact that you cannot be insecure about these people rising up and perhaps taking your job.
By the way, when I read in your book about the Motorola experience, it reminded me, I wrote a note in the margin, it is why you and my other half, Tom Healy, get along so well. Because that was, I said, oh my God, they're the same person.
we must be. Yeah.
So since we're now I want to move on, but people always say it's lonely at the top. And yet you had a lot of very warm relationships with former chairmen, either when you were moving up and then in your job. So is it lonely at the top, or what did you do about that?
It's very, very lonely at the top because even former chairmen, if they're going to trade in PepsiCo stock, you can't discuss anything with them. So I got ultra careful about mentioning anything to anybody, even at home, because some extended members of my family were in the finance business. I would hide all the documents under lock and key if they were coming to visit. So I became paranoid about it. And the other thing is you cannot discuss everything with your spouse. I mean, I have a highly educated spouse, so I can discuss anything with Raj, but sometimes they just get tired of listening to you bring up, issues about the job all the time. So you can't discuss things with your spouse. So what you're stuck with is talking to yourself pretty much. And that's what I would do. I would just sit in my bed and talk through the problem and try to come up with a solution. I would take the roles of different people and talk about all of those problems to this imaginary person. And I say, okay, maybe this is the way to move forward. So it is lonely. I'd say that to become CEO of such large companies like I was running requires incredible courage, resilience, and an ability to power through even when you don't have a support structure. Very, very important.
Well, and we're going to get to that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the economy and capitalism, which you also talk about. And you mentioned also in the book that you looked at megatrends and you sort of would write them down when you were at Pepsi. So for the audience today and looking forward, what do you see looking forward about the economy, about business, about capitalism, that perhaps some of the takeaways that people who are tuned in today can think about and take away with them?
Well, this whole looking at the next decade and trying to figure out, if I was CEO today, how would I shape the company for the next decade? And let me break it out into two ways. One is megatrend as it relates to the world and the economy, generally, and then as it relates to food and beverage, the company that I used to run.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So I'm not going to get into food and beverage now because that's too specific. Let me stay with the general stuff. As I look at the global economy, the first thing I look at is demographics, because at the end of the day, we have to worry about the population growth, the shape of the population, where is it growing? And the thing that worries me a bit is the aging of the population. We're going to have a huge bubble of people crossing the age of 60 coming into retirement. And that has huge consequences for consumption, for care, for retirement, and what pool do we have to do our jobs? We have issues on who's going to care for the retirees. Do we have enough in our pension plans to pay these retirees? So that's a huge trend that we ought to be thinking about. It also presents opportunities because products that you want to sell to retirees, that market is going to be huge because this retiree population also has some semblance of savings that can be used to buy goods and services. So I think this is a huge mega trend that has good things and some dark sides to it. So that's a huge mega trend that everybody should be excited about, concerned about, and want to do something with it. Trend number one. Second, I see the growth of digital technologies in every which way. Anywhere you turn, digitization is going to impact our lives. For the better, I think. It's going to make medicine better. It's going to make living as an older person better. It's going to make living as a young person fun, because with gaming, you can learn better. You can interact with people better. So digital technologies are going to impact everything we do. However, there's a dark side to that. The dark side is that people who don't understand digital technologies are going to be left behind, because you cannot participate in working in the digital environment or interacting with them. But the bigger issue is, how do we deal with privacy, cybersecurity, and all of those issues related to digital technology? So I'm very excited about what digitization can do, Fred. But the dark side of it worries me on privacy and cybersecurity. And along that, the thing that worries me is I think private companies in technology are many steps ahead of governments that have to regulate them. And so we have a mismatch, and we're always trying to pull the horse back to the barn and say, come back, and after it's gone long ways away. And so I don't know how we're going to address this issue with, how do you get total experts into governments so you can regulate what's coming as opposed to after it's well developed and on its way. So that's another mega trend that I worry about. The third mega trend that I'm concerned about is the rise of national borders. We talked about the world being flat. And then we had the pandemic. Then we have the supply chain crisis. And all of a sudden, we're talking about bringing things back to countries. It's going to be a challenge because it's very hard to move supply chains. You can't move supply chains out of a highly populated country like China to a country like Vietnam, where the population is highly limited. You can't move gigantic ecosystems to India. India is not yet ready for it. It will be, but not yet. And to bring it back to the US will take a while, especially if it's low value added products. So to me, I think there's going to be a period where everybody has to compete and cooperate at the same time. Countries have to compete and cooperate. And big countries have to think about products and services of tomorrow that we want to have in the country, as opposed to how do we bring back products of yesterday back to the country. So I think there's going to have to be, you as a trade expert should know this very well, there's going to be a very, very sensible discussion about what should be onshored, what's strategic and what should be onshored. How do we take a knowledge economy and bring back the right manufacturing onshore? And manufacturing is not just assembly, it's also components. How do we bring it all back? What are the cost consequences of it all? That's a trend that has to be thought through very, very carefully, because right now there's a lot of talk, but not much action.
Right.
Because, we have a quantity, not just quality mindset. So we're looking for the lowest cost items to buy. And as long as there's free markets, people are going to go to the lowest cost source. And that's going to cause supply chains to go offshore. So I've given you 3 megatrends. I could go on. This is a topic unto itself.
Well, interesting, you mentioned supply chains. My book came out 2 years ago and I would explain it. And in the ensuing time with COVID, all of a sudden, supply chains is just part of the lexicon, part of our conversation today. And when I wrote the book, I would have to explain, what is the supply chain? How does that work? So that is a change. One of the things I think about in your book and as CEO is, how do you square long-term strategic thinking with quarterly earnings? You talk about that a little bit. You mentioned a part when Nelson Peltz tried to accumulate some stock. When you can sell stock, you can buy it today and sell it 2 hours later. It goes against making long-term bets, the kind of things you're talking about, mature markets, digitization, supply chains. So how do you square those two? Because that is a challenge for anybody on this conversation day in running a company or an enterprise, or even a nonprofit for that matter.
But I'm going to give it to you from my perspective. Sometimes I scratch my head to see why this is not the universal perspective. First of all, I think CEOs should run companies for the duration of the company, not the duration of the CEO. And that's what boards should be constantly thinking about. Is this company making the right investments for this company to be successful for decades? Or is the CEO trying to maximize performance for the period that they decide they're going to run the company? Because it's very easy for a CEO to say, I'm going to run this company for 6 or 7 years. Let me cut, slash, and burn, deliver great results, and then hand it off to the next CEO. So that's the first thing boards have to worry about. And you've got to put the right CEO in place who thinks that way. Second, if you anchor the company strategy in a view of the megatrends and be crystal clear in talking about it to your board and the outside world. When people come in to perturb the company and say, I want more money in the short term, you can have an intelligent discussion on, what do you want me to cut? This is what I'm doing to run this company, the capabilities I'm building, this is the kind of company I'm building for the future. I'm not suggesting that you sacrifice short-term performance in totality. It's a question of judiciously balancing level and duration of returns. Sometimes we get seduced by a very high level of returns in the short term, hoping that somebody else will worry about the big splat. My point is the boom splat is a terrible way to run a company. You've got to decide what's the right level of returns to ensure reinvestment and to make sure this company stays successful for the long term. So the board has to be fully aware of the strategy of the company and what it's rooted in. And the CEO has to have the courage and conviction that whatever the outside forces are that try to take you off your game, you are going to articulate the same thing again and again, unless somebody can prove that you were wrong. And that's what I was trying to do. In all my time, I was CEO and succeeded. But I just think rather than talk about ESG in isolation or talk about signing on to a business roundtable statement in isolation, I think we all have to make it part of our business future and talk about why it makes sense to run business in a responsible way, because it lowers costs, it allows you to get a license to operate in all the countries, and it's the most responsible way to run a company for the long term. Because companies are rooted in societies. You cannot afford societies to struggle because of what the company is doing. So I just think that's the sensible way to run the company, run a company.
Well, that actually brings us to the third section and the final section, is which you just started on. Let's talk a little bit about changes you think are needed in the workplace, in the economy. Capitalism does seem to be at a crossroads. Inequality in country after country, rich and poor countries, seems to be widening. Populism is on the rise. How did we get here? You have some insight. How did we get to this place that capitalism is now sort of being questioned? I mean, you talk to millennials and they believe in socialism. I'm not sure they know what exactly that means. I mean, many people feel it means about healthcare, but how did we get to such a crossroads and such a questioning of capitalism right now? And what do we do about it?
I mean, I feel like asking you the question, what is capitalism? It's almost like questioning the fundamentals of it. What capitalism has done, at least the way we think about it, free markets, entrepreneurship, thriving, et cetera, et cetera. The whole idea was that let creativity thrive, let entrepreneurship thrive. Let's solve all problems through a completely free market and exchange of ideas. But that did not mean that you didn't owe society a duty of care. That's not what it meant. It didn't mean that you can let innovation thrive, entrepreneurship thrive, but on the backs of people who you pay very little to, and have a large percent of the population struggle to make ends meet. That is not what capitalism was about. Never was intended to be that way. I think that what's happened is we have forgotten that portion of the population that actually makes life possible for us. I'll give you an example. If you take somebody who's making $10 or $12 an hour as a caregiver, it's a single mother with 2 children, which a lot of the caregivers are. At $12 an hour, how do you make ends meet? How do you make ends meet? You cannot, okay? Yet we sit there going, hey, care centers have all been brought up by private equity. And for them to generate a return, they have to cut costs. And one way to cut costs is instead of having 10 workers, you have 8. And instead of paying 15, you pay 12, or don't give them a raise. Most caregivers have an evening job working in a Starbucks or some other hourly job. But who's going to take care of the kids? So I think we've gotten to this point where make the almighty buck at all costs and keep making more and more and more of it in a model which does not lend itself to efficiency. And then do it on the backs of a large number of people who are struggling already to make ends meet. And then we wonder why we have the great resignation, Fred. And here's the irony of it all. We've all been talking about the great resignation. For some reason, I think we've lost our humanity. We're not talking about what are we going to do about those people who just can't make ends meet, who can't manage family and the work because they don't get paid enough, they don't have care. Stress is at the highest level it's been. And people are just begging for help and pleading for a change in the way we reward people at the tippy top. And so I think that we have to bring humanity back to capitalism. Who's going to do it? I don't know. Who's going to do it? I don't know. But the fact of the matter is our incentive structure is structured so that, the benefits flow to the top, really. And, even as we think about the future of work, office workers have flexibility. the essential worker has zero flexibility. And yet we've spent all our time in the last year talking about future of work as if the only people that count are the office workers. Do they work hybrid? Do they work flexible? Do they work 4 days a week? Do they stay home all the time? That's all we've talked about. That's all. We haven't yet talked about the caregiver, the nurse, the cleaner, the hospitality worker, the manufacturing laborer, the fulfillment center, the
Agreed.
truck driver, who has absolutely no flexibility, in many cases, no predictability. The wages really haven't gone up to keep up with the
Right.
lack of childcare or support structures. And that's 70% of the population or more. And for some reason, again, we have lost our humanity in talking about these issues. So I think future of work has to put the essential work in the center. Future of work discussions has to put families in center and start to talk about how are we going to address all of this under this glorious system called capitalism. How are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? I don't know, Fred, but somebody better do it because there's a lot of people hurting.
Well, and you're right. And the political discussion in this country and in the United States often is about how do we forgive college debt? And I'm thinking, as you just said, that is forgetting 70% of the population that's really struggling. And yes, college debt is a huge burden, but they tend to be higher income people to begin with versus essential workers.
I mean, essential workers are who I worry about the most. And if you look at the great resignation, people in caregiving, hospitality, those are the jobs that people are quitting in large numbers. And those are the people that make life possible for many of us. They're the backbone jobs. And so I think the time has come for us to expand the discussion on future of work, to start with the essential worker, rather than, spend so much time thinking about robotics, automation, flexibility, 4-day work week, whatever it is for the office worker.
This has been more, you talk about this is also much more extreme for women in the workplace at every level, and women executives, and not having a support structure. So what thoughts do you have about that? And maybe what can HR, human resources, do at companies to change that and be those advocates?
I look at women as an extraordinary talent pool, Fred. So I approach the whole discussion on women as an economist, not as a feminist. I look at the numbers in the United States. 70% of high school valedictorians are women. Women are getting more college degrees than men today. Women are hungry. They want the power of the purse. They don't want to, be constantly dependent on a male for their livelihood. Women in STEM disciplines are getting 1 point higher GPA than the men because they work hard. In professional schools, they're now getting more degrees than the men. Wharton School of Business has 52% women this year. MIT has got 47% women grads in engineering. So I'm talking about an extraordinary talent pool that we have that could help us grow our economies, it could help us grow our companies. For some reason, we have stopped looking at them as a talent pool and looking at them as women. They've got family responsibilities. They may quit the job if the stress gets too heavy, rather than saying, what an extraordinary talent pool. How do we use them intelligently, provide them the support structures? And what if we educated everybody that family is not female? What if we said family actually involves a lot more than a female? It involves both both parts of the partnership in family building, and both have to step up to take care of the family. And how do we put family in the center of future of work? Instead, we're still here talking about women's issues. We have to talk about it only because we're not making progress. But we have to start thinking about women as an extraordinary talent pool on the one hand, and the people who really have to be available and show up in all those jobs like caregiving and
Right.
hospitality. Without women, those jobs are not going to happen, especially with an aging population, going back to the megatrend. And so We have two ends. Without women, a lot of the essential jobs are not going to happen. And women are an extraordinary talent pool, on the other hand, for knowledge workers. So we have to start a discussion about don't be dismissive of women. You need them. Start to think about what can you change to make women feel wanted, supported in the workplace, as opposed to having to fight established biases and practices. This is where HR comes in. If there is no pay parity for women at the workforce with the men for the same job, HR should be held accountable. Where is HR? They are human resources people. They have to make sure there's pay parity. If there's unconscious bias, HR should be watching and counseling managers to say, hey, cut it out. As should the CEO. Believe me, as CEO, we own the responsibility too. So I think that it starts with all of us recognizing the incredible talent pool that women are. And if we approach this truly as economists and not keep saying, oh, these feminists are arguing for a seat at the table. If you want the best and the brightest, look at the whole talent pool. Take away your gender lens. Look at it as a talent pool. And I think you'll have a much more equitable society if you did that.
We're going to go to Q&A in about a minute or two. I will tell you, Andrew, you may recall, we have something to learn from penguins. I just came back from Antarctica. And when the female penguin, when the mother of the chicks goes out to sea to get food, the male penguin sits on the nest and takes care of the chicks while the mother is out at sea. I think that maybe we could learn something from penguins, but because it's certainly.
Do they take turns to go out and get the food?
They take turns to go out to get food for the young.
I'm glad to hear that.
So they may be ahead of us. Maybe that's something we can strive for. I'm going to ask one last question while people think of their questions. The concept of maximizing shareholder value has come under scrutiny because, and I think I've heard you say, we have to begin to think about what kind of world do we want to live in? How do you do that in a corporate environment when you've got shareholders and quarterly earnings and so forth to be accountable to on a regular basis?
I mean, define maximizing. Is it maximizing at all costs? Maximizing by disenfranchising a group of people? Is it maximizing from a discounted cash flow basis or maximizing on a quarterly basis? I think those are the discussions to be had, because if you really think about discounted cash flow approach to companies, which is how companies are typically valued, the boom splat should not be happening. Typically what happens is people look at a DCF for the duration of a CEO.
I mean, a discounted cash flow.
Discounted cash flow. So when a new CEO comes in, they assume that you're going to tank the financials and start afresh. Why should it be that way? From CEO to CEO, it should be a seamless transition. For some reason, anytime a new CEO comes, the investment community says, take a big charge, then you can ride the alpha. If you look at it that way, the incentives are wrong again. So I think the investment community has to start thinking differently too. I'm all for maximizing shareholder value. I'd say optimizing shareholder value as opposed to maximizing it, because maximizing it is an invitation for bad behavior.
Right. Leslie, it's 9:40 on the East Coast of the United States. So we have about 20 minutes left. So let me turn it back to you and see what our audience would like to ask.
This is wonderful. It's tremendous. We have terrific questions, Indra. I'm going to start with the first one, which is about diversity inclusion, as you call it in the US, and equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI here. And it sort of builds off the last few questions. And I guess my question is it just the right thing to do, including people from different ethnic and national gender backgrounds? Or is there really good data? I mean, in your experience, did you find that there was either good data or you just sort of knew it when you saw it, that the ideas were better, that people were more productive, that the company worked differently? Which of those is it? The right thing to do, or it really transforms, our working culture and our productivity?
I've seen a lot of the data, and most of the data points to the fact that companies with more women on boards or women in senior positions or more diversity on the board or in senior positions actually have better returns, have happier employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For some reason, everybody who looks at that data says, must not be right. There's a flaw in the methodology. So I don't know what to do about this, Leslie, because any study you show on maximizing shareholder return, people jump on it and say, see, this is how you should run the company. When it comes to this one issue on diversity and inclusion, people start to question whether the analysis is accurate or whether there's too much bias or somehow doesn't pass their gut test, okay? So I don't know how to address this issue. All that I will tell you is the following. You should not ignore big pots of talent just because you have inbuilt biases in the company. Many people feel like it's easier to work with people who look like them and talk like them and have the same background as they do. Easier to work with somebody doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to better decisions. We are talking about what's the right thing for the company, not what's easier for you to work with. And if the data shows, and if you know that you're hiring from the best and the brightest amongst the entire pool of talent, you will have a diverse company. Let me add one thing. Diversity is a metric, a number. Inclusion is a mindset. If you're not going to have an inclusion mindset in the company, it's very hard to just bring the numbers in because they will leave. So we have to be very thoughtful and planful about starting this journey on diversity, building the numbers, and then retaining them. I think that's equally important because if people leave, you're going to create a nightmare for yourself within the company.
Thank you very much for that.
You're on mute, Leslie.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Khushbu Mehta. And the question from Khushbu is, even in the 21st century, women are being still found in traditional given roles, which involve taking more unpaid household care and child responsibilities. But perhaps what's more surprising is that having a preconceived notion for women as being the multitasker. This has added a new dimension and taken a toll on the well-being of women. So what stories do we need, according to you, to make an impact? I mean, this question about multitasking, does this create more of a burden for women?
Well, I'm a bad person to ask this question because I am the ultimate multitasker. And, I rose up in the CEO ranks when technology did not exist. Zoom didn't exist. Most of these video conferencing technologies were not ubiquitous. We didn't have the smartphone, didn't have FaceTime, texting, none of that stuff. And so I had to travel all over the world, couldn't really talk to my employees via video conferencing technologies. And I had to make sure that, I had to address things in school or whatever with my kids by rushing over in person as opposed to getting a picture or a text message of what happened. And so my brain was multiplexing 24/7. I had, books with lists, kids, home, personal, the office, and all night I'd get up and keep updating the list. So I am a very, very bad example of how not to multitask. I will tell you that it's mentally taxing to multitask because if you drop the ball even once, you feel like a total failure. And I did a few times. So this juggling act is hard to keep up. What I would say to anybody is, if you're going to have kids, if you're going to have a family, if you don't co-opt your partner in the process, that's a problem. You've got to have the conversations before you settle down as a couple and have kids about sharing the responsibility. Okay? And if that's not going to happen, then you are going to end up multitasking. Because if you're going to have a job, if you have kids, if you have a home, you can't just leave the kids and say, you're on your own, kiddos. Somebody has got to care about them. And I think it takes two to play this game right, and choose wisely is all I would say.
Thank you. And I should say, for those of you who haven't yet read the book, the stories, Indra, that you tell about your relationship with your family and especially with your children are really, they're really hit home. They're extraordinary. It's a powerful read. It's a wonderful read. And it's very meaningful. We have a great question from Jessica Cecil. Jessica is on the Academy faculty. She has had a very long and very distinguished career with the BBC. She writes, why do you think you are one of the only women who has been a CEO of a major company? Do you believe the missteps of senior women are forgiven less? And if so, what do we do about it?
I think the numbers are difficult to understand, because if you think of the executive pyramid, people come in at the entry level. Let's just take PepsiCo, maybe 15, 20,000 people at the entry level in managerial ranks. And by the time you get to the top of the company, there are 15 people in the C-suite. The guys are running the business and guys and gals. And then amongst them, you pick one person to be the CEO. So think of the process. You're going from 15 to 20,000 to one. So it's a very, very steep pyramid. And you've got to put in the hours and the effort and the results and the strategic thinking and the building of teams to get to the top. And you're doing it with everybody else trying to do the same thing. So you've got to do it better than anybody else. And if you also want to have a family in the process and you want to keep your marriage in the process, that's an awful lot that you have to go through. Men have had the luxury of having a spouse at home who basically took care of all of the issues for them. And they could just focus on the job. And in fact, the wife came along when they needed the spouse to come along. Okay. Most women don't have that. So many female CEOs either don't have a family, have a stay-at-home spouse, or they're getting divorced because it's very hard to manage all of it. I think that I'm hoping that the younger generation today, the couple are having conversations about how both of them can balance each other's schedules and work life to be able to make all of this work. Remote technologies will help. Flexible work will help. Hybrid office environments will help, because you don't have to go through the pressure of going to the office, coming back, and all the time wasted. You can use your time more intelligently. So my hope is that more women will stay in the workforce. They won't be stressed out as much. And you need the numbers at the top to be able to pick one woman to lead the company. There's only one woman bubbling to the top. It's very hard to pick from one, universe of one. But if you have 6 women at the top level to pick from, the chances are high that you could have a woman CEO. So you've got to grind it out to get there. And you need a support structure to get there.
This next question, Fred, I imagine you'll also have something to say. But Indra, I should also say, and you know it better than anyone, the other thing that really comes through in your book is the role of your mother. And you didn't just have clearly a wonderful partnership, but you had your mother there, and there's also that moment when you didn't have her, and I remember reading that and thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen to Indra's children? Because we read the book and we can really feel, as a woman who's a working woman, we all know what happens when those unsung heroes that make daily life happen suddenly
Leslie, to be honest, I had multi-generational living in our home all the time, the typical Asian family living, both in my in-laws and my mother, and my uncles and aunts who all volunteered to come and help. Just have to tell you, it was wonderful when my kids were small. But if you fast forward, that responsibility, multi-generational responsibility, doesn't go away. And it's a huge responsibility and a huge challenge, because, as your parents get old, that's a huge responsibility you're undertaking, because you're responsible for them now almost as you're responsible for your kids. So it's both hugely positive and it's got its challenges. So I want to be honest with all of our listeners here today.
Thank you. Our next question is also excellent, from Sandeep Mishra. And Fred, again, I'm sure you have both many things to contribute to this. What is unique about US corporates that UK and EU corporates may need to learn from, to incorporate? What are the lessons to be learned?
Fred, do you have a point of view on that before I weigh in?
Well, I think one difference that I have learned, and that is the whole board structure. You know, in outside the US, the chair and the CEO is usually a split function, and that the board has responsibility for sort of risk and the enterprise, and the CEO is more about execution. That model doesn't really apply in the United States. That's a very different model that we have here. And so I think there's a greater articulation of those two different roles than in US corporates. But Indra would have some insight on that, obviously, as well.
Well, it's interesting. An issue which has a dark side and a good side is what really makes US corporate so exciting. The fact that a US CEO can get paid an extraordinary amount of money, which in European corporates is capped in many ways. The fact that US CEOs can be richly rewarded makes them want to do more and more and more and grow the company and do more innovation and take more chances. And as a consequence, you see more excitement in US companies. People love working for companies where they know they're going to get rewarded. And people I know who are in European corporations, there's a lot more shareholder pressure on what do you pay the CEO, and is it too much? And bonus levels are not that high. They don't get as much stock options as US CEOs do. Like I said, it's got a good side and a dark side. The good side is that, you've got something to aspire to and push. The dark side is that, people can argue that the CEO is being enriched at the expense of the company. If you can balance these two things properly, it could be a wonderful formula for success.
Tracy Jacks has a question, and Tracy writes back to these earlier issues. She's very curious about the early part of your career. What was the balance for you at the start of your career when you were a mom? How did you balance having children in the early stages with your work?
I would throw that word balance out because there was no balance. It was a grind. Every day was tough. God help. Like, as Fred said, some member of our family always came to live with us, even if it's for 60 days or 90 days. They'd just come as, to help us out. They'd fly in from India and help us out and go back. They didn't ask anything of us. They helped us. I still don't know why they agreed to do that, but they did it. And without that, we couldn't have managed. Because, we were living in Chicago at that time. You could get caught in a snowstorm. I was a consultant, in some little town in the Midwest, couldn't get back. I had the comfort that a family member was with my little one. Did I struggle still? Yeah, the guilt overwhelms you. But when you come here with nothing, and my husband and I just married, we still don't have any savings. We're trying to pay off our college loans and, just trying to stay above water. There's a huge motivation to have to work. And, now we're looking at this first child and saying, we better have enough money put aside so that she doesn't ever have to struggle. So we not only have a responsibility to us, we've now got an intergenerational responsibility to our daughter, our first daughter, before the second one came along. So I think that motivation resulting from not having any money was huge. And that makes you sort of park your guilt a little bit to the side, leverage as much as you can of your ecosystem, and somehow make it happen. It has its challenges, Leslie. It wasn't easy.
Indra, one thing that really stands out in your book is that the family support, but you say at one point, when I came into my house, I was told by my mother, here you are the wife, you are the mother. And so it really is powerful throughout the book, the balance between, you came from a very traditional background and that pressure was real, but also this tremendous support. And I think that tension is one that I think, again, the storytelling of it is really powerful because so many women contend with those very conflicting, I think, pressures.
I think the biggest issue is all of us go through this challenge of having a foot on the brake and a foot on the accelerator. Our hopes and dreams have a foot on the accelerator. And the fact that we have so many responsibilities puts a foot on the brake. So the real question is, how do you have a heavier foot on the accelerator and have somebody help you with the foot on the brake. And that's the real thing.
I think this next question is very important. Chandra Emmanuel writes, to what extent did your early education at school, college, and culture in India influence you in the United States?
I grew up in the world's largest democracy, and I thrived in the world's oldest democracy. So democracy was the common factor in my life. Second, look, I grew up in India until I was age 23. And you cannot underestimate the fact that I grew up in an environment where everybody looked like me. I never felt discriminated against. I didn't feel different. I didn't lack for confidence, put it that way. I had a family that said the boys and girls are going to be brought up exactly the same way. They pushed us and they pushed us and they pushed us to study. And if you didn't get good grades, they came down like a ton of bricks and helped you learn the subject matter quite well. And they paid for us to go to the right schools and colleges. We had to get in, but they paid for us to go there. And so I will always be grateful to my family who prioritized the kids and their education over their own, comforts. They gave up all the comforts for themselves and basically supported the kids. And we are a product, my sister, myself, my brother, we're all products of our upbringing in India that was really brought into focus in the US because the environment was so much more welcoming of people like us and allowed us to, thrive.
I think your answer is a lesson not only for women who are working, but it's also a lesson for those of us who are raising daughters and sons. So I thank you. We're gonna, one last question. And Fred, I don't know if you will also want to flesh this out, your experience, but also your experience of Indra. Sandra Lilatemi writes, on several occasions, Indra Nooyi, you have appeared in the rankings of the most influential women in business in Forbes, the most powerful and influential businesswomen. What advice would you have for women in general and to women from minorities in particular who admire you, who think it's impossible for them to succeed in a world that does not necessarily give them the opportunity? And Fred, Indra, this is our last moment to hear from both of you. It's been tremendous, and this is perhaps a wonderful question to conclude.
I just give my perspective. Don't let these lists get to you. The problem with these lists are that you have to work hard to stay on that list. Because once you get on it, if you don't deliver every time, you're going to get thrown out or relegated to a lower number. So, one of the things I did tell my head of PR in PepsiCo, when these lists come out, do not publicize it inside the company. Do not send out a PR, in our daily news saying Indra Nooyi was ranked number 1 in Fortune's most powerful business. It's irrelevant. So just park those lists on the side. Just say, hey, very few women, you're on the list, that's fine. Second, you don't get on lists because of your looks. You don't get in there because of your pedigree or anything. You get in there because of your competence and how you perform. So everything starts with great performance and your core competence. And I'd say this to everybody, including women. In today's world, if you want to remain competent and want to have a skill that everybody knows is your go-to skill, you better be a lifelong student. Because the world is changing so rapidly around us. Everybody has to recommit to learning new skills, new disciplines, new areas every day if you want to remain competent and be viewed as somebody to be reckoned with. So the bar to be noticed, the bar to move ahead is significant. The good news is you don't have to read whole books. You can read abstracts, you can read summaries, you can see YouTube videos. There are many more ways to get stuff now in sound bites. So you use all those technologies to enrich your thinking, but it all starts with competence. That foundation is what we have to focus on.
Fred, you've been a tremendous supporter of people. You've played a tremendous role on human rights, on LGBT rights. Is there anything you can add for us on Indra, your experience of Indra on leadership before we give Indra a final word and we draw this to a close?
Well, one, I think Indra said it very well about mentoring, and I forgot who said this, but God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that ratio.
Epictetus, yes, the Greek philosopher, right? Yeah.
Listen, wonderful. Indra, this has been tremendous. I know that we can listen to YouTube clips and we don't have to read the whole book, but I have to say, this is a really great read. And I really think it's a storytelling read. It's a narrative read. And you don't just listen to the YouTube. Do read the book. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. Fred, thank you for bringing Indra to us. Thank you for the conversation. And thank you to all of our audience and our members for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.